Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about Vietnam. Is Vietnam still our best friend in Southeast Asia? The evolution of its relations with the US and China. Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor of Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Good to be here, Jay, and always fun to talk about Southeast Asia and Vietnam in particular. It's really become one of the leaders, I think, in Southeast Asia.
Vietnam has been a diplomatic and economic success and a friend of the US since not too long after the American War ended. We need to follow how it is doing now in order to preserve and explain. We need to follow how it is doing now in order to understand that relationship. So, Carl, I guess the top news is all about the tariffs. Can you tell us the status of the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed or plans to impose, and the status of the negotiations around those tariffs?
Yeah, it's been pretty quiet on that front with Vietnam. They've sent some delegation to Washington to talk about it. I haven't really seen any specific news. I mean, the tariff, the reciprocal tariff that they want is 46%. Which is fairly high, and it's of course based on the trade imbalance. And the reason there's a big trade imbalance is because Vietnam builds a lot of things. A lot of people have moved manufacturing into Vietnam. Vietnam has been very aggressive in taking in foreign investment into Vietnam, and so yeah, I mean it's there. I think Vietnam is really sort of a secondary thought to the Trump administration as far as when they get their negotiated rate. I think it's not going to be 46%. And the people in Vietnam seem pretty confident that they can get that number down by negotiating with Trump based on their relationship with China and the United States.
What about the situation around visas and for that matter countermeasures? A lot of countries have made it more difficult to get in. And the whole Trump tariff uh, uh, program has resulted in a lot of countries saying, "Okay, you want to hold us up, we'll hold you up." And of course, they impose countermeasures or threaten to, and then they also require visas when they weren't requiring them before. What's the status of the visa situation?
Yeah, well, Vietnam the American citizen is still required to have a visa, and they do it online. I just anecdotally, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and normally in the past, you would submit your visa application, and within 72 hours, you'd have it back. This time, mine took almost 2 weeks to get it back. I don't know if that's because of some sort of retaliatory measure or not, or if it's just they're busy, they have a lot of tourists, and so they didn't get around to sending my visa back. They've made the form a little more complicated. But again, I think that's just uh, not really related to the tariffs. I think this is just Vietnam trying to get a better handle on who's coming into the country. But several years ago, Vietnam had dropped the visa requirement for most Europeans and most Asians. The United States is one of the few countries that still requires a visa into Vietnam. So this is sort of a long-standing thing with Vietnamese that they still have this reciprocal relationship with the United States because the United States has made it difficult for Vietnamese to come into the United States. Vietnam makes it a bit more complicated for Americans than for most other uh, countries.
Vietnam has been successful in terms of its economy. They say that it's the number two economy in Southeast Asia. I'm not sure what the number one economy is, but they also say that these tariffs are likely to damage the Vietnam economy. Your thoughts?
Well, sure. I mean, if you have 46% tariffs, it's going to damage Vietnam's economy for sure, because they send a lot of shoes and a lot of clothes to the United States. That's still one of their big exports, and so specifically shoes, I guess, is a big item for Vietnam. Uh, but Vietnam has also done a pretty good job of diversifying their manufacturing. They have big plants set up by several of the electronic companies. Samsung is big. Korea in general has done a lot of investing in Vietnam. Japan is there. Even Taiwan has moved a lot of semiconductor uh, manufacturing into Vietnam. So there's a lot of people that have moved into Vietnam, and they've diversified uh, a lot of their manufacturing away from just the consumer goods that go into the United States, and they have developed their markets with both ASEAN, other ASEAN Southeast Asia countries, as well as with China, as well as with Europe, and the other Asian countries. So they've done pretty good. They'll be affected by the tariffs, but it's not going to devastate.
Yeah. Who is the number one economy in Southeast
I
Asia?
mean, it depends on what you're calling number one. I mean, certainly Singapore is probably the number one economy in Southeast Asia, simply because it's the most sophisticated and has the highest services record. If you're talking about growth could be the Philippines, could be Indonesia. I just don't know what they're calling when you say number one. I'm not sure
Hmm.
what that means. It certainly isn't the number two or number two. Certainly not number two in size.
Vietnam is very effective and rational about business, and I would expect that they would think of all kinds of things for countermeasures or protection against the tariffs. And so, as you mentioned, they're apparently trying to trade more among Southeast Asia. But are they trying to trade more outside of Southeast Asia? I mean, export to Europe, export to Canada, Mexico, Latin America. Is that part of their countermeasures? Because if they have all these factories that produce shoes and electronics and what have you, and the U.S. is going to block those things with high tariffs, the only rational approach is to sell it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think I mean that's the strategy, I think, and they've been diversified. That's the point I was trying to make, is that they've been diversified. They recognize that there's been this tension with the United States over the high imbalance in trade. This has been going on for some time. They've also bought a lot of Boeing aircraft. They've done that. They're looking at buying F-16s, fighter aircraft, as a way to offset that imbalance. So yeah, they're diversifying the economy away from the United States, but they're also trying to accommodate more imports from the United States by shifting the defense sector, as well as the aircraft, from Europe to the United States.
Let's talk about the export, or rather the import of weapons. The U.S. is the biggest exporter of weapons in the world, and fighter jets are strategic weapons. And you wonder, I mean, of course, it's good for the American balance of trade, and maybe good for some sort of deterrent in Vietnam. But what does Vietnam need fighter jets for?
And the same reason everybody in Southeast Asia thinks they need fighter jets. I mean, mostly it's air defense, but a lot of it is prestige. Uh, I mean, they don't really think of themselves as doing ground attack on Cambodia or something. And so, but if Thailand has 20 airplanes, then if I'm in Vietnam, then I should have 20 also. And it's just the mindset of competing with your neighbor. And I want one of those shiny objects too.
It's surely what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So the policy that I caught when I did a little reading on this was that the government of Vietnam was trying to mm, reduce the number of babies. I'm not sure why, and increase the number of exports. Well, that the second part is clearly, I understand why. But what about the babies? Why in the world would they want to reduce the number of babies? And by the way, the news also said that they had not succeeded in doing that.
Actually, they had a two-child policy in Vietnam for some time. I can't remember when it started. Probably 10, 15 years. Maybe. Uh, Vietnam is a very young population. I mean, when you go to Vietnam, the average, I can't remember the average age is significantly lower than countries in Northeast Asia, where you have this huge depopulation phenomenon going on. Vietnam has a lot of young children, and so this was part of the development process. Certainly looking at China, as an example. They saw this as a way to speed economic development by having fewer children and more people in the workforce and less large families. And now they've come to realize that, as everybody else realizes, that as you develop economically and women work outside the home, it becomes less and less attractive for families to have large number of children. So now they're recognizing that their two-child policy isn't necessary, much like China has recognized probably too late that the one-child policy is probably not uh, thought through. So it's a matter of overweening government trying to manage too much. And don't forget, Vietnam is very much a communist country. There is one party in China or in Vietnam, and the Communist Party has a lot of control over what happens in the country. So, we often talk about the PRC with a rather nasty tone about the Communist Party, but the Communist Party in Vietnam is equally as strong as the Communist Party is in China.
Well, I think they're doing a good job. And just as I would say, also the Communist Party in China, in many ways, is doing a good job. It may not be, we have tensions with them in the US, and certainly members of the government have tensions with them, but they do a good job at managing the economy sometimes, most of the time, and managing the country. In China, and I want to ask you about China. China seems to be developing a middle class lifestyle, although having problems these days. They have taken great strides to develop a middle class lifestyle and lots of education, lots of technology, lots of development of cities and services in those cities. So maybe this is propaganda, but my impression from the media is that they're succeeding in that, although they have obviously these days challenges. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, interesting you bring that up because as I said, I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago talking about those kinds of issues. And in fact, the comment was made by both the Chinese and the Vietnamese that, yeah, we've done well in developing our cities, but you have to realize that there's still a large portion of those countries that are rural and very, very poor. So they see themselves as being successful in the cities and developing this emerging middle class lifestyle, but they also recognize in both countries that there's another large percentage of that population, and I pick a number, 60%, 70%, 50%, is still very well below the poverty line and live a very poor rural lifestyle.
Well, you have to control the population if that's the situation. Otherwise, everybody would migrate to the cities, wouldn't they?
Well, and this is a big problem in Vietnam, that Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh and Da Nang have grown tremendously. And Hanoi is often cited as the most polluted country in the world, or it's a city in the world.
My wife and I were there a couple of years ago, and we saw that pollution.
It just kind of hangs over the city for a good part of the year. That pretty unusual to see the sun full bright in Hanoi.
China, I guess in a funny way, there's kind of a connection. Maybe it's a strategical connection. Maybe it's an economic connection. Maybe a cultural connection. But what is the connection between China and Vietnam? They've had hard times together. But I think Vietnam kind of recognizes China as a sort of big brother geopolitically and economically. Am I right about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Vietnam. I mean, I always think Vietnam and Korea have a lot in common, and the biggest thing they have in common is they have China as a very close neighbor, and they've learned to manage that very large neighbor. I think, and they've both been fairly successful in their own ways. And China, and certainly Vietnam. I mean, remember the late '70s, there was a war between Vietnam and China over the land border. So and the Paracel Islands, Vietnam still makes a claim to those islands, even though the Chinese have built a city in in the Paracels, and that's not ever going to go away. So there's still territorial disputes between the two. But Vietnam is very careful to quietly oppose China. They don't do it vocally and visibly. So Vietnam has what they call they're very proud of their bamboo diplomacy, where they work with everyone and they're friends of everyone. That's their end goal, is to be friends of everyone. So they maintain a relationship with China. They maintain a relationship with the United States. They maintain a relationship with Russia. And they strive very hard to maintain a balance in that. And that's why they talk about bamboo diplomacy, that it can bend, but it won't break, sort of mindset. And so they're very adept at knowing what China demands and what they can get away with vis-a-vis China. So they have a huge economic relationship. It's a vibrant relationship, and it's a one that both sides pursue. In the meantime, Vietnam has also developed a military force that is capable of defending Vietnam, and that goes back to the fighter aircraft. Yeah, they aren't out doing practice bombing runs in the north, but they certainly are capable of defending Vietnam. So and then in the maritime spaces, Vietnam is actively building artificial islands in the South China Sea and in their occupied land features. And yet you don't really see China doing much about that or making as much fuss about it as they do about the Philippines with their couple of artificial islands that the Philippines are occupying. So Vietnam understands how to work around some of the uh, belligerence that comes out of China regarding its neighbors. That they understand that if they do it quietly, China kind of looks the other way as long as the economic relationship is beneficial to both sides.
Sounds a little like non-alignment in India. It sounds like so many countries have this kind of approach. It sounds like it's the best approach. It sounds like if you were the Secretary of State of any number of countries, you would say, Carl, hey, this is the way to go. Don't align. If you want to, react to something that China or other large countries are doing, do it quietly. Don't get in their face about anything. And this is a good policy. This is a policy that many countries are doing and should do. Don't you agree?
Yes, but you also understand that that is exactly the Chinese narrative. Is that we believe in mutual benefit. We believe in a strong sovereign state, and what happens within the sovereign state is the business of the sovereign state. And so yeah, it's very much what China wants to hear. And yes, countries recognize that, and especially Vietnam, because it's as close to China as it is. It realizes it has to accommodate that. So yeah, it's an attractive model, and it's a model that the Chinese are pushing through their global development initiative, their global security initiative, their global cultural initiative, are exactly centered on those very themes. That do what you want inside your own country, but don't you mess with China's interests, and don't try to involve yourself with other affairs. Just stay with us, and we'll provide this beneficial relationship.
Well, we know that Vietnam is not as a member of ASEAN. I don't think it's a member of the Quad. I wonder if it's courting the BRICS organization, because there's a lot of courtships going on.
It's part of BRICS as of this year.
Hmm.
Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have all joined BRICS in 2020.
So what does that mean? What does it mean for Vietnam? What does it mean for BRICS? What does it mean for the US?
What it means for Vietnam and BRICS is that it basically can take advantage of any financial relationship that it has with the other countries in the institution. What it means for the United States is it loses its influence over the finances in Vietnam, and it has less control over the broader financial markets or the financial plumbing, if you will.
What does it mean for Vietnam's relationship with the US that it's a member of BRICS?
It only means that Vietnam has broadened out its perspective. The United States still wants to be a part of the relationship with Vietnam because it sees benefit in that relationship. So Vietnam is the quintessential Southeast Asia trying to take advantage of both systems, and both sides recognize the value of maintaining that relationship with Vietnam. So for Vietnam, it doesn't really influence the relationship with the United States.
Would the United States prefer that it was not a member of BRICS?
Oh, sure. The United States would rather have total dollar dominance. And this is what Trump has threatened, that BRICS better not try to challenge the dollar dominance in the financial markets, because this is going to cause problems for the U.S. Financial. I don't think it has much impact on the diplomatic relationship. What it does have an impact on is the concern that the U.S. has of losing control of the global currency markets and the global transaction market. So BRICS is trying to set up its own currency exchange amongst the BRICS members. So you can do trade with other BRICS members in their currency, and you don't have to convert everything to dollars. And this, of course, is what Trump is concerned about. Is he sees BRICS as a challenge to the dominance of the dollar in the currency and financial transaction.
He's right, isn't he?
Sure, sure. I mean, there's no question that the United States is losing its grasp on the currency markets, and that's why when you look at what is happening with the threats of tariffs, is it's diminishing the United States' role, and it's facilitating this move toward alternative mechanisms, because they see the United States as an unreliable partner. So you have the dollar depreciating, and you have the bond market uh, losing value because they don't see the American market as a stable market.
And they could be right.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about two things that I noticed in my reading here. One is that Qualcomm, which is a huge multinational technology company, is opening big factory in Vietnam. And that should tell us something. American company, started in America, big presence in America, opening a big factory in Vietnam. What does that mean for Vietnam? What does it mean for Qualcomm?
Well, it means that Qualcomm is probably moving out of China into Vietnam to produce computer chips. I can tell you that not last visit, but visit before, one of the visits in the last year, I couldn't get a room at the hotel, and I found out why, because NVIDIA had a huge conference at the hotel. They were introducing NVIDIA chips into manufacturing into Vietnam. So they're all not all, but a lot of the big corporations are trying to move out of China into Vietnam. Vietnam has been a country of choice for people diversifying out of China.
What's the incentive?
Cheap labor, less restrictions being put on by the Americans. The Vietnamese aren't covered by this exclusion, this chip exclusion act. They are seen as a at least partially friendly shore to build factories in. So some of it is moving things through Vietnam. Others are simply saying we're going to build things in Vietnam and export them to the West.
But not to the U.S., because wouldn't they fall subject to tariff
Well,
and other
if
restrictions?
yeah, if and this is part of the concern. If that 46% stays, if the reciprocal 46 stays, then yeah, it's a big problem. But everybody, the taco move is saying he's not really going to follow through.
You got to give them credit. Here's an American company developed its brand from America, from its base and its development in America. and then it goes to a place like Vietnam where the labor is cheaper, and again, capitalizing on that same brand, it sells it to the rest of the world, and everybody says, "Oh, Qualcomm, quality product, go buy it," even though it doesn't have as big a presence in the American market as it used to. It's really interesting what's happening. Let me go to another news story that I picked up, and that is that Vietnam has now organized flights to Denmark, to Copenhagen, and that's a long way off. And what does that tell us about Vietnam? I don't know the national airline. Was it Air Vietnam? Um,
Vietnam Air. Yeah, Vietnam.
Vietnam Air.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what does that tell us about the national airline? What does it tell us about, the the s- the state of globalism in both places, in
Yeah.
Vietnam and in Denmark?
Yeah. And it's hard for me to imagine why Vietnam is flying direct to Copenhagen. I mean, they fly all over Europe. I think Vietnam flies to some American cities, if I'm not mistaken. I think they fly direct to San Francisco. Maybe. I'm not sure, but it's a global airline. It's a huge airline. Actually. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed in Vietnam is number one, their airports haven't kept up, and so they're always crowded. But the other thing is that they have a very vibrant air traffic market, mostly because of the shape of Vietnam. If you look at it, it's a big, long country that would take 3 or 4 days to get from Hanoi to Saigon, just because it's a long stretch of coastal land. But they've got several large carriers. They have Vietjet, which flies all over Asia. They've got Vietnam Air, which, as you say, flies to Europe and I'm pretty sure to the United States. And then you've got other Bamboo Air is still there, and so they've got several other regional airlines that are flying in and out of Vietnam. So it's very much a global country and very connected to the rest of the world. And it sees itself as an important player in both ASEAN and in, again, relationship between the United States and China. It sees itself as someone that can be a real mediator in that relationship.
Well, I think people are investing in Vietnam. I know a guy who had holdings here in Hawaii, and one day he decided that wasn't really productive for him, so he sold everything he had in Hawaii, invested it in Vietnam,
Mhm.
made a lot of money in the process.
Yeah.
So it's a good place to invest. But I wonder about Americans leaving, expatriates, if you will. And I keep hearing stories. I'm sure you do too, about people who are leaving the U.S. because they're not confident of what the Trump administration is going to do. They're worried about the uncertainty, the loss of civil rights, all that. And one guy announced to me that he'd signed a lease for an apartment in Canada, and he was going to move there. Another guy took out citizenship in a country in Europe. And there's a lot of stories like that. I don't have to tell you. You must know about these things. And the question is Vietnam a good destination for Americans? Are Americans going or planning, plan B planning to go and live in Vietnam if it gets to be intolerable for them here in the US?
Well, you see foreigners. I'm not sure. Certainly some are Americans, but there's a lot of Australians and Europeans that have moved to Vietnam. I mean, you see them in Hanoi all the time, driving motorcycles like a local. They weaving in between traffic, and they've integrated themselves into Vietnam society. But if you're concerned about your First Amendment rights, Vietnam is probably not the place you want to go. I mean, they're, they don't kid yourself that the Communist Party doesn't control the media and your ability to express dissent very much. So, I mean, there's better places to go if you're concerned about your First Amendment. Uh, but Vietnam is a comfortable place. it's like most Southeast Asia. They pretty much leave you alone, unless you do stupid stuff like they do in Bali. But otherwise, the Southeast Asia I see a lot of people who have clearly retired in those places, or even younger folks that it's not clear what they're actually doing there. It doesn't look like they work because you see them in the middle of the day, and they don't look like they have a suit on for sure. But yeah, there's any number of people that find it comfortable living in Southeast Asia. But again, broadly, Southeast Asia and Vietnam in particular always strikes me as odd if you're trying to get away from what you see as an encroachment on your civil rights. Vietnam is probably not the place you should.
What about cost of living? What about,
Yeah,
quality of life issues for either a Vietnamese person or an expatriate immigrant?
well, certainly. I mean, you can buy a, a nice, really nice apartment, or you can rent a nice apartment for less than $2,000 in Hanoi. And that's an expat quality kind of apartment. It's not one that has marginal uh, maintenance and all that. It's a nice high rise apartment. So it's cheap, and that's part of the attractiveness, of course, is that it is cheap, and food is much cheaper in Vietnam. I think the average Vietnamese probably makes less than $1,000 a month.
I love Vietnamese food. I always have. But I have saved one last question for you, Carl. And this is a question I really don't know the answer to. Um, a country like Vietnam, um, for most of the time since the American War, has been remote, maybe ostracized in some ways, and determined to build its economy, sort of like China for a long time, determined to build its economy. So it wasn't all that concerned about climate change. It wasn't all that concerned about carbon emissions. It was concerned about building its economy, which is like the opposite direction, actually. But now there's an emissions trading program, a pilot phase of an emissions trading program has been initiated. And this is intended to encourage major industrial sectors by the government, to encourage major industrial sectors to cut the amount of carbon dioxide they produce. I don't know what the sanctions or penalties are, but that's been a subject of some news in Vietnam. They're real serious, maybe more serious about that than the US or many states in the US, even at the height of concern over climate change, which we're sort of past that. But I wonder if you can help explain to me why climate change and carbon emissions have become important, and why they are putting so much priority on it.
Well, I mean, it's not just Vietnam, it's Southeast Asia in general has taken a strong commitment to climate change. Part of it is it's a norm within ASEAN, that ASEAN has been pushing climate change because climate change very much impacts Southeast Asia. You've got Thailand, Bangkok sinking. You've got Indonesia with Jakarta, going underwater. You've got the haze in Southeast Asia from people burning palm oil or palm uh, plants uh, every year, and so you've got a huge environmental awareness in Southeast Asia of the impact of climate change, uh, extreme temperatures in countries in Southeast Asia. So there's very much an awareness, and there's a very strong commitment in Southeast Asia to the carbon commitments from the Paris Accords in what was it, 20 COP 20? Yeah, it's COP 20. That's right. Yeah, and so there's a very strong commitment to meeting those commitments to reducing carbon footprint. And so that's part of the reason why you see this resurgent interest in nuclear energy to move away from fossil fuels. You see a commitment to solar energy. Vietnam has a huge amount of solar energy. In fact, so much that they kind of have overcapacity in solar, and they're trying to figure out how to integrate it now because you need a base load, you need energy for a base load, and there's so much solar that they can't quite meet the base load requirement. So it certainly is a big issue, and Vietnam is one of the leaders in trying to promote carbon reduction. But again, it's a broader Southeast Asia phenomenon, and it's mostly a commitment to what they see as an imperative for the impact of climate change.
I guess my last question is to ask you to give us your view of how we should be seeing, we, the United States, should be properly, with good foreign policy, how we should be seeing Vietnam, how we should get closer to it or not, how we should deal with it in terms of business and global trade or not, how we, the citizens, should be thinking about it. Could you help me by giving your view of that? Why don't we make you the Secretary of State? What would you think about it, and what would you do about it?
Well, one thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't not show up at the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, which is what we did. So I wouldn't do that for sure. I mean, unbelievable that we decided to not let the ambassador participate in the 50th anniversary celebration. It was one of the remarkable things that has happened this year. But certainly, we need to recognize Vietnam for who they are. They are a country that wants to develop. They want to be your partner. They want to be a friend of everybody, and they're not going to do what you want them to do. They're going to do what they see as best for Vietnam, and you need to recognize it. So don't fall in love with Vietnam, but recognize Vietnam as an important partner who can facilitate your better relations in the region, and recognize that they're going to do the same thing they do with you to China and to Russia and any other takers in the global diplomatic arena. So understanding that, then take advantage of their cheap labor costs and build manufacturing there and trade with them and facilitate their role as a leader in ASEAN and help them develop policies that are supportive of U.S. interests, which should be climate change, a reduction in tension in maritime spaces, and better economic integration with the economies in Southeast Asia.
Well, Carl, in the title here we said, is Vietnam still our best friend in Southeast Asia? Is it? And if not, do we want to make it our best friend?
No, we don't want it to be our best friend. I don't think. I think we want Singapore to be our best friend, quite frankly. But we don't want to. We don't. What I guess what I'm saying is we don't want to pick winners in Southeast Asia. We should be wanting to treat Southeast Asia as an important bloc of countries that can help the United States maintain a presence and maintain influence in Asia. Because if you don't do that, then China will take full advantage and dominate Southeast Asia. And this is exactly what Southeast Asia fears, is if they lose the relationship with the United States, China will dominate because China is so much bigger and so much more powerful than the individual countries. So what the United States needs to recognize is that Vietnam is an important part of ASEAN, but it's a part of ASEAN, and that those countries want to stick together. They want to work together because they recognize there's strength in numbers in that part of the world. And so that's how we should treat it. And we should acknowledge that. We should facilitate ASEAN leadership to the extent that ASEAN is willing to lead on anything. And they are. They just need to have encouragement and support from countries like the United States and Europe.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to our guest, Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections, and we've been discussing, is Vietnam still our best friend in Southeast Asia or not? Thank you to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.